World News Tonight, the man who led the search for weapons of mass destruction throughout Iraq says the intelligence was almost all wrong. He wants an independent investigation. John Kerry rolls out of New Hampshire. There were 7 contests for him and the other Democrats next week. That's a huge winter storm moving across the country, worse in some places, especially the ice. And home from the war, the joys and the challenges of being back.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone. We're going to begin tonight with a very tough and depressing assessment of U.S. intelligence. Today in Washington, before 2 committees of the Senate, David Kaye, the man who led the U.S. effort to find illegal weapons in Iraq, said, and he included himself, "We were all wrong." ABC's Linda Douglas in Washington listened to some of the most compelling testimony.
America's former chief weapons inspector gave a stinging critique of the pre-war intelligence about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
It turns out we were all wrong, probably in my judgment, and that is most disturbing.
In the politically divided Senate, each side heard what it wanted to hear. Democrats say David Kaye provided further proof that the war in Iraq was based on false premises.
It is highly unlikely that there were large stockpiles of deployed, militarized chemical and biological weapons.
The case which the administration made to the American people was the presence of actual weapons of mass destruction.
The senior Democrat on the committee cited a series of claims made by the White House before the war.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction.
He's amassed large clandestine stockpiles of biological weapons.
It possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons.
When we decide to go to war, it is totally unacceptable to have intelligence that is this far off.
That is what is so frightening to me, because we make such serious life and death decisions relying on this intelligence information.
But other Republicans pressed. Might chemical or biological weapons yet be found? Not a large stockpile, but...
The operative word in your assumption is large. Several small caches could constitute an imminent threat.
It's possible that they could be there or we could never find them.
Do you have any evidence that they had any stockpiles, large or small, in 2002?
Simply have no evidence, Senator.
Levin accused Vice President Cheney of continuing to spread false information. Just last week, Cheney said there is conclusive proof that Iraq had mobile bioweapons labs. Kaye said today the labs were making weather balloons. Cheney was misled, said one Republican.
The reason that the Vice President apparently keeps referring to the trailers as mobile labs is that is the view of the CIA as I speak. It's on the CIA webpage.
Republicans found comfort in Kaye's view of the bottom line.
I think the world is far safer with the disappearance and the removal of Saddam Hussein.
There is no evidence, said Kaye, that the White House pressured the CIA to distort the evidence. But Democrats say they do want an independent to investigate, and now David Kaye does agree.
Many thanks, Linda. Linda Douglas in Washington on the Kaye hearing today. In Britain today, a judicial inquiry has cleared Prime Minister Tony Blair of charges that he exaggerated intelligence about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, although the quality of that intelligence is still in question. Today was an important victory for a man who's been criticized by millions of his own people for supporting the president's war effort. Here's ABC's Jonathan Karl.
Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Tony Blair was completely exonerated by one of Britain's most respected judges.
The allegation that I or anyone else lied to this House or deliberately misled the country by falsifying intelligence on weapons of mass destruction is itself the real lie.
The allegations have dogged him for months. The most damning?
You're listening to Today on Radio 4.
A British Broadcasting Corporation story that accused the Blair government of, quote, sexing up intelligence on Iraq by knowingly including false information in a document about Saddam Hussein's weapons, including this alarming claim.
He has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
Investigator Lord Hutton concluded today that even if Blair's claims turn out to be false, they were, at the time, supported by British intelligence. Hutton also found that the government is not to blame for the suicide of British weapons specialist David Kelly, who killed himself after it was revealed that he was the source of the BBC story so critical of Mr. Blair. Although it was thought this report could ultimately doom Tony Blair's government, instead the harshest criticism was aimed squarely at the British Broadcasting Corporation for allegedly incorrect and irresponsible reporting.
It's a pretty amazing result, really. The inquiry finds that Tony Blair did everything right. He's a saint. And the BBC did everything wrong, and they are evil, evil men.
He gets out of everything. It's outrageous. But that's showbiz, isn't it? That's politics these days.
At 6 o'clock, Lord Hutton slammed
Lord Hutton's report prompted an apology from the BBC and the resignation of its chairman. Whatever questions remain about British intelligence, President Bush's closest ally is, for now at least, vindicated. Jonathan Karl, ABC News, London.
In Baghdad today, a suicide bomber driving a van disguised as an ambulance killed 3 people and injured 17. The attack was outside a hotel used by Westerners, a South African man among the dead. There had been intelligence warnings that insurgents might carry out attacks using fake ambulances. Well, the Democratic race for the presidency has moved on from New Hampshire to 7 states holding primaries and caucuses next Tuesday. John Kerry's convincing victory in New Hampshire last night certainly strengthened his position as the party's front-runner. Now the Massachusetts senator must show he can also do well in the South and farther west. First, here's ABC's Kate Snow.
On the day after what he called a tremendous victory, John Kerry braced himself for a grueling schedule.
It's always hard. The test of running for president is a long one, and it's a tough one.
Today, he traded his campaign bus for a 737 and headed to Missouri, Dick Gephardt's former territory, now up for grabs. The senator is well aware this is a national campaign now, with an immediate focus on the 7 states that vote next Tuesday. Kerry will visit all 7 over the next 7 days.
Under George Bush, we have a government that works for those at the top, not you.
The campaign bought ad time in all of those states beginning today. And Kerry's already reaping tangible rewards from his New Hampshire victory. The campaign says it's raised nearly $250,000 on the internet today. Headlines around the country are giving Kerry the kind of national visibility money cannot buy. And the official endorsements are snowballing. In one of the critical states next Tuesday, Kerry has won the backing of a man all of the campaigns were courting. James Clyburn is a South Carolina congressman who's also something of a kingmaker.
Senator Kerry has a resume that fits very neatly with South Carolinians. South Carolinians believe in moderation. They believe in steadiness.
Kerry is still trying to suggest he's not the front runner.
I expect to compete with the same underdog mentality.
But it's getting harder and harder to make that case.
Senator Kerry just started speaking at a rally here in St. Louis. He said on the plane ride here, Peter, that he's going in strong into all of these states, including Missouri. But he also said he's not sure if he's going to be able to win those 7 states. Peter, he said, we're competitive.
Many thanks, Kate. Kate Snow with Senator Kerry. This is a critical week for most of the other Democratic candidates. They have been in some cases campaigning for at least a year, more in other cases. And they now face increasing pressure to demonstrate that they can win somewhere. With so many other states holding primaries and caucuses, there are actually opportunities there. Here's ABC's Dan Harris.
The candidates began heading their separate ways today, leaving New Hampshire for a whole new landscape, with more ground to cover and less time in which to do it. General Wesley Clark jetted off to Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona. Senator John Edwards went to South Carolina, Oklahoma, and Missouri. And Senator Joe Lieberman and Congressman Dennis Kucinich both hit Oklahoma. There won't be as much time for personal politicking now. Fewer pancake breakfasts, living room rap sessions, and back road bus trips. Now it's about airplanes, ad wars, and news coverage. For all of John Kerry's advantages in this new environment, money, momentum, and media coverage, he may be vulnerable. He doesn't have any more name recognition or organization than his opponents do in the states that vote next week. His rivals are making strategic decisions about where to focus their resources. John Edwards says South Carolina is a must-win.
I was born in South Carolina. I have family in South Carolina. I have roots in South Carolina. I will not forget where South Carolina is after February the 3rd.
Unlike the other candidates, Governor Howard Dean did not hit the campaign trail today. He came home to Burlington, Vermont to regroup and rethink. ABC News has learned tonight that Dean will replace his national campaign manager, Joe Trippi. Today, Dean, the former frontrunner, took a swipe at Kerry.
We will have middle-class tax fairness, but you cannot, as Senator Kerry is doing, promise people middle-class tax cuts, health insurance for everybody, help with their college, et cetera, et cetera.
Thus far, Kerry's rivals have been reluctant to hit him too hard. That may soon change.
I think it's impossible right now for any of the candidates to go into a state, make their case, and not deal with the white elephant in the room, which is John Kerry having just won 2 surprises in a row.
This year's condensed election calendar was designed by party leaders to produce a nominee with maximum speed and minimum intra-party battling. But despite John Kerry's head of steam, there is a chance his rivals will score some wins next Tuesday, dragging this race out for weeks to come. Dan Harris, ABC News, Burlington, Vermont.
Will be an interesting week, our presidential campaign coverage of the day. When we come back this evening, freezing weather shuts down parts of the country. We'll take a closer look tonight at what it's like for the 82nd Airborne to be coming home. And at the end of the broadcast, listening closely to Howard Dean that night. It was very different for the people who were there.
This is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Brought to you by Walt Disney World Resorts.
Well, the latest winter storm to complicate life in many parts of the country is on its way out into the Atlantic Ocean tonight. It left a great deal of snow and ice in its wake. For many people, it's turning out to be an old-fashioned winter with all the pleasures and all the misery. Here's ABC's Ned Potter.
Solid ice off Massachusetts. Wind chills in the Dakotas of 60 degrees below zero. And in New York, one more snowstorm. The city has already had 33 inches of snow this winter. That's 23 inches above normal.
Oh, this is crazy. This is nuts, just too much.
At the New York airports, more than 800 flights were canceled. New York City schools, which have 1 million students, called their first snow day in 3 years. And then there's the cold. This month is turning out to be the coldest January for New York since 1977. The coldest for Boston since 1934.
And I'm tired of snow. I'd rather go to Florida, I think.
Climate scientists say to blame the jet stream. Most of the time its path shifts from day to day. But for 3 straight weeks now, it's been stuck in a pattern that draws cold air south from Canada into the Great Lakes in New England.
What we've seen over the last month is a lack of that shift, where it's cold, followed by cold, followed by cold, no warm-up.
Other parts of the country have had intermittent warm-ups, but they have hardly been spared. Today in the Carolinas, electric crews were still cleaning up after Monday's ice storm. More than 300,000 people lost power. Oklahoma is still getting over its own ice storm. Omaha is cleaning up a foot of snow. And Michigan got 8 new inches.
I don't know why I moved here. I ask myself that every day that it snows.
Temperatures in the Northeast have been below average every day since January 7th, and the cold is not forecast to break for another 2 weeks. Ned Potter, ABC News, New York.
In other news today, government officials say they have broken the largest counterfeit cigarette smuggling ring they've ever busted. Suspects in 5 states are accused of selling foreign tobacco repackaged as brand name cigarettes in the U.S. Authorities say that cigarette smuggling costs the country $1 billion a year in lost taxes. When we come back this evening, what it's like to finally leave Iraq for home.
World News Tonight.
The U.S. Army's Chief of Staff told the Congress today that more than 100,000 soldiers may have to stay in Iraq through 2006. General Peter Schoomaker said he'd asked his staff to find a way to replace the troops going in now with a comparable force next year and the year after. Pentagon is currently engaged in the largest troop rotation since the Second World War. It includes members of the Army's 82nd Airborne Division, who returned to North Carolina today. That gave ABC's Ron Claiborne, who traveled with them, a chance for a closer look.
Hey, great job out there. Welcome home.
It was dark this morning when the men of 3rd Platoon Alpha Company stepped onto the icy tarmac.
There's Daddy!
After this brief ceremony, the one order they'd been waiting for. It is an iconic image. The soldier returned home from war.
Thank God.
Oh, it feels good. It's like unbelievable still.
It's the best feeling in the world to know that your husband's home safe, finally.
The 82nd Airborne flew into southern Iraq last March for a quick strike mission that turned into a 10-month deployment. Sergeant Tyler Williamson spent almost every night there on patrol, on a raid, or in battle. Now he wants to forget all of that.
I know for a fact that something's going to be in the back of everybody's mind about over here. But I'm going to try and put it out as far away from my mind as I can for a little while.
For Sergeant Richard Page, who won a Bronze Star, home means quiet, family, and a thick grilled steak for dinner.
I'm interested in just getting home and being with my family.
Yeah, everyone else owes me beer. I don't have to.
Having a home-cooked meal from actual home, not here.
Getting home to North Carolina took 4 days of shuttling from base to base, from tent to tent, and a 20-hour flight on a cold, crowded airplane.
When we get back, it's going to be a completely different lifestyle, so it's going to take some adjusting.
For the first time, returning soldiers are being required to undergo counseling to help them adjust to being home. The concern is that their combat experiences and being away from home for so long can put them at risk of post-traumatic stress, domestic problems, even suicide. When Sergeant Mike Bechtel was on leave last November, he says he was constantly on the lookout for roadside bombs, as if he was still in Baghdad.
They can expect some of that, I'm sure. I know I did when I was home on leave, a little edgy, a little, jumpy.
They may be home, but they're not yet free. First 2 weeks of counseling, then they'll get 30 days of leave. These soldiers call being home, being back in the world. Ron Claiborne, ABC News, Pope Air Force Base, North Carolina.
Our closer look today with the 82nd. When we come back, that speech one more time, only hearing it one more time in a completely different way. So finally this evening, the roar of the crowd as heard by the crowd. There were not many people, we think, who missed seeing an excerpt from Governor Howard Dean's pep talk to his volunteers the other night after he lost in Iowa. The governor has been the butt of jokes. His adversaries have tried to take advantage of the moment to suggest that he's an angry man. Well, we thought it might be a good idea to try putting ourselves in the room. ABC's Diane Sawyer has done just that.
This is the scream Howard Dean says became famous after the media played it nearly 700 times in just a few days. And not only that, his camp adds, what we heard on the air was not a reflection of the way it sounded in the room. Well, after my interview with Dean and his wife, in which I played the tape again, in fact played it to them, I noticed that on it he's holding a handheld microphone, one designed to filter out background noise. It isolates your voice, just like it does with Charlie Gibson and me when we have big crowds in the morning. The crowds are deafening to us standing there.
Did you already say good morning? I can't hear myself think.
But the viewer at home hears only our voice.
Free societies do not breed terrorism.
And what about this speech by President Bush?
What we're doing for the long term, we're promoting freedom.
Is it different if the crowd doesn't react?
What we're doing for the long term, we're promoting freedom.
So we collected some other tapes from the night of Dean's speech, including one from a documentary filmmaker. Tapes that do carry the sound of the crowd, not just the microphone Dean held on stage. We asked reporters who were there to help us replicate what they experienced in the room.
What the cameras didn't capture was the crowd.
As he spoke, the audience got louder and louder, and I found it somewhat difficult to hear him.
So listen now. This is Dean's boisterous countdown of the upcoming primaries as we all heard it on TV.
Dakota and Oregon.
But here it is again, with the microphones on the floor.
We're going to South Carolina and Oklahoma.
And what about the scream as we all heard it? Well, listen to how it was in the room. The so-called scream couldn't really be heard at all. And what about the number of times we all played that scene? We called the presidents of the cable and major networks to ask if in hindsight they thought we'd overplayed it. With the exception of NBC, they all said collectively the media did overplay it. CNN said if we had to do it again, we'd pull ourselves back. And the chairman of Fox News? We overplayed it a bit, and the public clearly thought so too, and kept Dean alive for another round. Diane Sawyer, ABC News, New York.
That's our report on World News Tonight. I'm Peter Jennings, back off the road for a spell. Have a good evening and good night.